When my ex-boss first threatened to destroy my reputation, I froze. The words were casual, almost offhand, but they carried a weight I could feel in my chest. If you speak out, your career is over. I remember standing in the office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, feeling the cold grip of fear and betrayal. I had given years to this company, invested every ounce of energy, stayed late nights, sacrificed weekends, and trusted this man completely, believing he respected me. But suddenly, all of that trust felt fragile, like a glass about to shatter. I went home that evening, the rain dripping down the windows, my mind racing, and for the first time in months, I felt truly small, truly powerless. The kitchen was silent, only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing by outside breaking the stillness. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the table, staring at the steam rising from the mug, trying to think, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of the decision I knew I had to make. I had two choices: remain silent and protect myself, or take a risk that could either ruin or redeem everything. I remembered the moments leading up to this, the promotions I had been passed over for, the subtle dismissals in meetings, the way my ideas were praised in private but ignored in public. The tension had been building for months, almost a slow erosion of my confidence, but I never imagined it would culminate in a direct threat. I thought about my colleagues, the ones who had quietly supported me over the years, and a quiet rage began to rise, not a loud, fiery anger, but a cold, determined sense that I would not let him dictate my future. I thought about the documents I had access to, the financial records, the internal audits, the things he had always boasted about keeping secret, the things no one else dared to question. And a dangerous thought crept in. What if revealing the truth could protect not just me, but everyone he had misled? I spent that night packing my apartment, weighing risks and outcomes, feeling the storm of emotions, fear, betrayal, doubt, and a strange, simmering clarity. By morning, the decision had taken shape. I could no longer allow fear to hold me silent. I would act carefully, strategically, and quietly, ensuring that the truth would come out on my terms. I started with small steps, copying files, noting irregularities, documenting everything I had witnessed. Every keystroke felt like a heartbeat in my chest, a rhythm of defiance I had never known I could feel. I remembered the faces of those who had relied on him, colleagues who trusted the integrity of the company, and I realized this was no longer just about me. It was about fairness, accountability, and reclaiming my own sense of agency. The plan I began to form was cautious. One wrong move could destroy me, but the alternative, remaining passive, felt unbearable. I would leak the audit in a way that was undeniable, factual, and irrefutable, without exposing myself directly. As I organized the data, I felt a strange calm settling over me, a quiet strength I had not realized I possessed. The fear did not vanish entirely, but it was tempered by purpose. Each document I prepared, each detail I verified became a small victory, a quiet act of resistance against the man who had tried to intimidate me. I spent days double-checking everything, ensuring accuracy, protecting my anonymity, and anticipating every possible consequence. I imagined the moment the audit would surface, the shock, the scrutiny, the inevitable fallout. I felt a mix of trepidation and relief, a strange satisfaction in knowing that justice, in some form, would be served. I also knew that this path would change me. Once exposed, there would be no turning back. My professional life could take new directions, but I would have to navigate carefully, manage perceptions, and prepare for the inevitable chaos that truth brings. And yet, for the first time in months, I felt in control, not manipulated by fear, not trapped by threats, but empowered by my own choices. I thought back to my early days at the company, bright-eyed and eager, believing that hard work and loyalty were enough to earn respect. I realized now that respect could be demanded, earned, or defended, but sometimes it had to be reclaimed through courage, through careful action, and through unwavering adherence to truth. On the evening I finally decided to release the audit, I remember the quiet of my apartment, the city lights flickering through the rain-streaked window, the soft strains of piano music in the background, and the strange mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through me. My hands hovered over the keyboard, my heart pounding, but my mind was clear. I pressed send, confident that the information would reach the right channels without betraying my identity, and then I leaned back, exhaling slowly, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. The days that followed were surreal. News began to surface, questions were raised, and the scrutiny turned toward him. I watched from a distance as the once powerful figure scrambled, no longer in control, and I felt neither glee nor vengeance, only quiet affirmation that truth, finally, was being recognized. Colleagues whispered, journalists dug deeper, and the company began to confront issues that had been hidden for years. And through it all, I remained unseen, protected by the careful planning I had executed. I realized in that moment that the greatest power often comes from preparation, patience, and the courage to act when others are paralyzed by fear. Sitting in my apartment, sipping tea, listening to the rain, I reflected on the journey, on the years of sacrifice, on the subtle betrayals, on the threats that had sought to control me, and I understood that this moment was not only a turning point in the company's history, but in my own life. I had reclaimed my narrative, restored my dignity, and demonstrated that fear could be transformed into strategy. And as the city lights flickered and the rain softened to a gentle drizzle, I realized the quiet lesson. You cannot always control the actions of others, but you can control how you respond, and in that choice lies your greatest power. The days after releasing the audit were unlike anything I had expected. There was a strange calm in the chaos, as if the storm had begun but I was standing on solid ground, observing from a distance. My phone buzzed constantly, messages from journalists, whispers from former colleagues, and even cautious inquiries from legal advisors. I stayed quiet, refusing to answer directly, letting the information speak for itself. Every time I opened a news article or an online update, I felt a mix of relief and disbelief. The man who had once held all the power, who had threatened to destroy me with a single word, was now scrambling to defend himself. And I, who had been invisible, was silently orchestrating the shift. I thought back to the months I had spent preparing, every file copied, every irregularity verified, every detail cross-checked. I remembered the long nights alone, the apartment silent except for the hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards, as I meticulously organized everything. Those nights, which had once felt lonely and daunting, now seemed like the foundation of my strength. I realized that my careful preparation had given me more than just leverage. It had given me confidence, a quiet certainty that I was capable of influencing outcomes without exposing myself to unnecessary risk. People began noticing changes at the company. Meetings that had once been dominated by his voice now faltered, as executives and managers were forced to confront the inconsistencies revealed in the audit. The internal culture, which had tolerated manipulation and favoritism, was now under scrutiny. Whispers circulated among colleagues, some shocked, some vindicated, and others fearful of what would come next. I watched it all quietly, learning from the unfolding events, understanding the dynamics of influence, power, and human reaction. Even without stepping forward publicly, I felt the subtle satisfaction of seeing accountability take hold. It was not a triumph of ego, but a triumph of truth. Yet the aftermath was not without tension. I received veiled threats, anonymous emails warning me to stop digging, to leave matters alone. Each one reminded me of the precarious balance I was navigating. I knew that one careless move could expose me, undoing months of careful planning. But I also recognized that fear had a strange way of shrinking when faced with clarity and purpose. I refused to be intimidated. I had acted based on principle, not malice, and that realization fortified my resolve. I reminded myself that the people who sought to silence me had underestimated the quiet determination that comes from a deep understanding of one's own capabilities. During this period, I also had to navigate my own emotions. Watching someone who had betrayed me struggle was not a source of joy. It was a mirror, reflecting all the feelings I had suppressed over the years: frustration, anger, doubt, and disappointment. I allowed myself to feel, but I refused to be consumed. I journaled each night, writing down observations, strategies, and reflections. Writing became a form of therapy, helping me process complex emotions while keeping my mind focused on the tasks at hand. The act of documenting my journey reminded me that clarity emerges not from avoidance but from acknowledgement. I faced my feelings honestly, understood their origin, and allowed them to guide rather than control me. The audit's release also revealed the depth of the mismanagement I had quietly suspected for years. Financial irregularities, hidden expenses, and questionable transactions came to light. I had always known that something was off, but seeing the evidence consolidated and verified gave the situation a new gravity. Colleagues who had once dismissed my concerns began to approach me with questions, admiration, and sometimes quiet apologies. It was a strange reversal. The person they had overlooked or doubted was now at the center of a shift in accountability. I did not gloat. Instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that truth had found its way, that the patterns I had observed and documented were now undeniable. Amid the professional chaos, I also had to tend to personal matters. Friends reached out, worried about the exposure, the potential backlash, and the stress I must be under. I reassured them calmly, even as I navigated the tension myself. I discovered that vulnerability and transparency with trusted people strengthened relationships rather than weakened them. I allowed myself small comforts: quiet walks in the evening, cups of tea, reading books I had long neglected. These moments were grounding, reminding me that while the professional landscape was volatile, my own stability was something I could control. The balance between action and reflection became essential, and I realized that enduring change requires both strategy and self-care. As the story gained momentum in the media, I began to notice subtle shifts in perception. People who had once dismissed me now speculated about my role, wondering who had access to the information, who had compiled it so meticulously. I remained anonymous publicly, letting the audit's content speak louder than any name or claim. I realized that influence does not always require visibility. Sometimes, the quiet architect is more powerful than the loudest voice. I found empowerment in the knowledge that I could affect real change without seeking recognition, without participating in the spectacle, and without compromising my principles. The man who had threatened me eventually faced formal investigations. Lawyers, auditors, and journalists scrutinized his actions, and the company's board demanded accountability. I watched from a distance, aware that every revelation, every question, and every corrective measure reflected the careful work I had initiated, yet I did not rush to claim credit. I allowed the process to unfold organically, understanding that timing, patience, and discretion were as important as the initial action itself. The lessons I had learned about strategy, observation, and restraint were proving invaluable. Throughout this period, I also reflected on the personal growth I had experienced. The fear that had once paralyzed me was now tempered by confidence. The humiliation of past dismissal had been transformed into insight, and the threat to my reputation, rather than destroying me, had sparked a journey of agency and empowerment. I realized that strength does not always come from confrontation. It often comes from quiet preparation, careful observation, and the courage to act with integrity when the moment arrives. I had learned to navigate complexity, manage emotions, and assert influence without aggression, skills that would serve me far beyond this singular episode. By the end of this chapter of turmoil, The company was in the midst of transformation. Policies were being revised, leadership practices scrutinized, and internal culture reshaped. I continued to remain in the background, observing, guiding where appropriate, and ensuring that the momentum I had created was sustained. And in those quiet moments, I reflected on the irony of the situation. The man who had threatened my career had inadvertently created the conditions for my quiet empowerment. His actions, intended to intimidate, had sparked a process that ultimately strengthened my confidence, sharpened my strategic thinking, and solidified my sense of integrity. Sitting in my apartment one evening, watching the city lights flicker through rain-streaked windows, I realized that this was more than a professional victory, it was a personal one. I had faced fear, navigated betrayal, and acted decisively, all without compromising my values. I had transformed a moment of potential destruction into a lesson in resilience, strategy, and the quiet power of truth. And in that realization, I found peace, knowing that my choices had not only protected me, but had also set in motion a broader change that would ripple far beyond my immediate experience. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of the audit began to reach far beyond what I had anticipated. The man who had threatened my reputation was now under constant scrutiny, his authority shaken, his past decisions questioned, and his once loyal allies whispering in corners. I observed it all quietly, never stepping forward publicly, but feeling an odd sense of calm satisfaction. The irony was not lost on me. He had believed he could manipulate, intimidate, and control outcomes with threats. Yet here he was, exposed by the very truths he had tried to bury. Every conversation I overheard in meetings, every hesitant glance from colleagues, reminded me of the careful planning and patience that had guided my actions. I realized that timing mattered as much as strategy. Acting too soon or too recklessly could have backfired, but measured patience allowed the truth to emerge naturally, unstoppable and undeniable. The attention on him brought new challenges, though. I received subtle warnings from external parties, individuals who feared the disruption my actions had caused. Anonymous messages arrived, suggesting I step back, implying consequences if I pressed further. For a moment, I felt the old stirrings of fear, the same unease I had known when he had first threatened me. But this time, the fear was tempered by understanding, by experience. I had seen the power of preparation, and I knew that careful action, grounded in truth and evidence, was my greatest ally. I did not respond directly to the messages. I had learned that silence and strategy often speak louder than reaction. Each warning only reinforced my resolve, reminding me that integrity and courage often invite resistance, yet these same qualities ultimately create lasting impact. I began to notice subtle shifts in the workplace culture. Employees who had once hidden mistakes or remained silent now spoke up, asking questions, raising concerns, and taking initiative. It was as if the audit had not only shaken leadership, but had also awakened accountability and confidence in others. Watching this transformation, I felt a quiet pride, knowing that my actions had contributed to something larger than personal vindication. The change was not immediate, nor was it perfect, but it was genuine. And in that authenticity, I found a sense of fulfillment that no recognition or praise could have matched. At the same time, the emotional weight of the situation required careful handling. I had to navigate my own feelings, satisfaction, relief, and a subtle sense of vindication, without letting them cloud my judgment or undermine the careful positioning I had maintained. I spent evenings reflecting, journaling, and walking through the quiet streets near my apartment. Each step, each thought, reinforced the lesson I had learned repeatedly. Action guided by integrity and careful thought yields far greater results than reaction driven by emotion. I also began to understand the deeper truth about power and influence. It is often less about force or intimidation, and more about timing, information, and consistency. By remaining calm and measured, I had shifted the balance in ways that others could not anticipate. Unexpectedly, I started receiving messages from former colleagues, some expressing quiet gratitude, others tentative curiosity. They had recognized the shifts within the company, seen the emerging accountability, and wondered about the source. I chose my responses carefully, never revealing myself, but offering subtle guidance or advice when it could make a real difference. This period taught me a valuable lesson about influence. One does not need to claim visibility to create meaningful change. Often, the most profound impact comes from quiet observation, discreet action, and strategic patience. I had witnessed this truth unfold in real time, both professionally and personally. The man at the center of it all, meanwhile, began to make mistakes under pressure. Decisions that once seemed calculated now appeared rushed and reactive. Meetings that had once been controlled by his authority became tense and disorganized. Colleagues who had previously aligned themselves with him quietly distanced themselves, wary of the increasing scrutiny and potential fallout. I observed this with measured detachment, recognizing that while the moment was tempting for ego-driven satisfaction, it was far more powerful to remain steady and let the consequences unfold naturally. True leverage, I realized, comes not from gloating, but from the quiet patience that allows truth to take its course. As the audit continued to circulate internally, the details revealed layers of mismanagement, errors, and questionable decisions that had been overlooked for years. I had anticipated many of these findings, but seeing them compiled and analyzed reinforced the gravity of what had been uncovered. Colleagues began to connect the dots, piecing together patterns that had once been invisible. It was fascinating, in a detached way, to observe the process of revelation, how transparency, once introduced, reshapes perception, behavior, and priorities. And through it all, I remained in the background, my presence unacknowledged but my influence undeniable. Amid these developments, I also had to navigate my own self-reflection. I had achieved a form of quiet victory, yet I knew that revenge, while satisfying in a strategic sense, was not the ultimate goal. The true reward lay in reclaiming my agency, in demonstrating that threats and intimidation could not define my path. I reflected on the years I had spent under his authority, the sacrifices I had made, and the trust I had extended. Those experiences, once painful, had prepared me for this moment. They had honed my patience, sharpened my judgment, and strengthened my resolve. And as I observed the unfolding consequences, I felt a sense of closure, not of malice but of completeness. In the midst of all this, I also found moments of quiet learning. I began to see the nuances of human behavior, the way fear, ego, and self-interest influence decisions. I observed colleagues who had previously remained passive now finding their voice, understanding that accountability is not imposed but cultivated. I noted the subtle ways leadership dynamics shift under pressure, how perception and trust shape interactions, and how strategic patience often outweighs immediate action. These lessons, though professional in context, resonated deeply with my personal understanding of resilience, agency, and integrity. By the end of this chapter in my life, I had gained more than professional satisfaction. I had discovered the power of preparation, the impact of strategic discretion, and the quiet influence of truth. I had learned that integrity, patience, and careful observation are more potent than threats, intimidation, or impulsive action. And most importantly, I had reclaimed my narrative, demonstrating that even in the face of humiliation and direct threats, one can navigate challenges with dignity, foresight, and purpose. As the weeks settled into months, the company began to stabilize under scrutiny, internal reforms took shape, and accountability became more than a concept, it became a practice. I continued my quiet observation, ready to act if necessary, but content to watch the natural unfolding of justice. In the evenings, I reflected on the journey, the risks I had taken, and the patience required to see it through. I realized that the greatest victories are often unseen, their impact measured not by applause, but by the subtle shift in balance, perception, and integrity. And so, as I sat by the window one rainy evening, the city lights glimmering softly through the droplets, I felt a profound sense of calm. I had faced threats, navigated betrayal, and acted decisively without compromising my principles. I had learned that true strength is often quiet, invisible to those who seek spectacle, and yet transformative in ways that echo far beyond the immediate moment. The man who had sought to intimidate me no longer held power over my life. I had reclaimed my agency, my voice, and my narrative. And in that quiet reclamation, I discovered the enduring lesson: fear can be confronted, threats can be neutralized, and integrity, patience, and strategic action can turn humiliation into empowerment. The calm I had found after the audit's release was only temporary. I soon realized that the real challenge was not just exposing the wrongdoing, but navigating the aftermath, how power shifts, alliances fracture, and subtle revenge takes shape in ways no one anticipates. The man who had threatened my reputation was now scrambling to regain control, but his errors were compounding. I observed quietly, analyzing each move, each word spoken in tense meetings, each glance exchanged between colleagues. The weight of the situation settled over me differently now. It was no longer just about righting a wrong. It was about ensuring that the change I had sparked would endure. It started with whispers in the office corridors. People who had once seemed loyal to him now hesitated, unsure of where their own best interests lay. Decisions were second-guessed, directives questioned, and the subtle fabric of authority he had woven began to unravel. I watched it unfold with a calm patience, knowing that every moment of hesitation, every inconsistency, reinforced the power of truth over intimidation. There was a strange sense of satisfaction in seeing the system shift naturally, without any force from me, only the careful alignment of facts and evidence that I had set in motion months before. Yet even as I observed, I knew the work was far from over. The man's desperation became apparent in small, almost imperceptible ways. Emails were sent hastily, memos drafted without careful thought, and meetings that once projected control now revealed frustration and fear. I recognized the pattern from years of observing leadership dynamics. When someone's authority is threatened, the instinct is often to overcompensate, to act impulsively, and in doing so, accelerate their own downfall. It was fascinating, in a detached way, to see this psychology in action. The knowledge that I had prepared meticulously, while he reacted impulsively, gave me a quiet confidence I had never experienced before. Meanwhile, I had to navigate my own emotions carefully. Watching him falter, part of me wanted to revel in justice, to feel vindicated in the humiliation he had once threatened me with. But I reminded myself that true empowerment comes not from schadenfreude, but from self-mastery. I allowed myself to feel satisfaction, yes, but tempered it with reflection and restraint. I spent evenings alone, journaling and reflecting on the journey. I considered how my actions were shaping not just his fate, but the culture of the company and the experiences of countless colleagues who had been silenced for years. It became clear to me that the real victory was systemic, not personal. The subtle shift in accountability, awareness, and courage that now permeated the workplace. At the same time, I began to receive unexpected messages from people I had not anticipated. Former colleagues, some distant and some previously antagonistic, reached out cautiously, sharing insights, confirmations, and even gratitude. They recognized the shift, the disruption of the status quo, and some suspected, rightly, that someone had orchestrated the exposure with precision. I did not respond directly. I maintained the anonymity I had cultivated carefully, understanding that visibility could undermine the delicate balance I had created. Influence, I realized, did not always require acknowledgement. The quiet architect is often the most powerful figure, unseen yet shaping outcomes with subtle precision. The man's attempts at damage control were increasingly desperate. He began to call meetings with the board, sending detailed explanations and partial admissions, hoping to contain the fallout. Each attempt only highlighted the discrepancies further. I watched from afar as patterns I had documented became undeniable. Every misstep, every overreaction, reinforced the meticulous work I had done in preparation. It was a lesson in patience. While threats and intimidation are loud and immediate, strategic calm, evidence, and foresight yield results that are both lasting and transformative. As the narrative around him began to shift publicly, I also began reflecting deeply on my own personal journey. The humiliation I had experienced, the threats to my career, and the anxiety that had once consumed me were now reframed in my mind as catalysts. They had forced me to develop skills I would not have cultivated otherwise: strategic thinking, careful observation, patience, and an unwavering commitment to integrity. What had initially felt like loss and betrayal had, in fact, been preparation for empowerment. Every sleepless night spent reviewing documents, every meticulous note, every quiet reflection had strengthened my capacity to act decisively and with impact. Amid this, small victories began to manifest in unexpected ways. Colleagues who had remained silent now began to voice concerns, pointing out patterns of behavior, inconsistencies, and errors. The culture that had allowed manipulation to thrive was slowly transforming. I realized that accountability, once established, spreads quietly but powerfully. Each acknowledgement of error, each corrective action taken, was a testament not to my desire for revenge, but to the power of truth and careful, principled action. Watching this unfold, I felt a quiet joy, different from excitement or triumph, more a deep sense of rightness and fulfillment. Yet the emotional landscape was complex. There were nights when memories of earlier fear and intimidation resurfaced, when I questioned whether I had acted correctly, whether the risk was too great. I reminded myself that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act thoughtfully despite it. I revisited my decisions, reviewed my documentation, and reflected on my motivations. I realized that my goal had never been vengeance in the dramatic sense. It had been reclamation of my career, my agency, and my dignity. And in that reclamation, I discovered the most profound reward: self-respect untainted by malice, strength tempered by patience, and clarity unclouded by reaction. As the weeks progressed, the man's position weakened further. Board members questioned previous decisions, external auditors scrutinized financials, and colleagues who had once feared speaking out now did so with cautious confidence. I remained in the background, careful not to expose my involvement, yet observing each development with a sense of quiet satisfaction. I recognized the profound irony. The very person who had tried to control me, to intimidate and silence me, had inadvertently created the conditions for my empowerment and the shift in the organization's culture. By the end of this chapter, I had learned something invaluable. True influence often comes from preparation, patience, and discretion, not from confrontation or intimidation. The greatest power lies in understanding the dynamics around you, acting with clarity and principle, and letting outcomes unfold naturally. I had faced fear, navigated betrayal, and acted decisively without compromising my integrity. And as I sat one evening in my apartment, watching the city lights shimmer through the rain, I realized that this journey had transformed me, not only professionally, but personally. I had discovered the quiet strength within myself, the ability to shape outcomes, and the deep satisfaction that comes from acting with purpose and patience. This was no longer just a story of exposure or accountability. It was a story of transformation, resilience, and the subtle power of truth. I had taken the humiliation and threat, the fear and uncertainty, and turned them into an opportunity for empowerment. And in that quiet reclamation, I found peace, understanding that the greatest victories are often those unseen by others, measured not in applause, but in the integrity, clarity, and calm strength with which they are achieved. This journey unfolded, the initial shock had passed, but the tension had evolved into something deeper. The man who had threatened my reputation was now facing consequences that went far beyond simple embarrassment. His authority had crumbled, his credibility questioned, and the network of influence he had cultivated over years was unraveling. I continued to observe from the shadows, careful not to reveal myself, yet acutely aware of the intricate ripple effects my actions had created. There was a strange satisfaction in watching the structures he had taken for granted begin to collapse under the weight of truth. I had not sought this outcome out of malice. It was never about revenge for its own sake, but seeing justice unfold with quiet precision brought a profound sense of affirmation. I spent hours reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The fear I had experienced when he first threatened me seemed almost distant now, replaced by a careful, deliberate confidence. Each move I had made, every document copied, every irregularity noted, every anonymous disclosure, was part of a strategy I had built over months. The stakes had been high, and the risk of exposure had been real, but preparation, patience, and meticulous attention to detail had allowed me to navigate the dangers without faltering. I realized that empowerment often comes quietly, emerging not from loud confrontation, but from careful, thoughtful action executed with unwavering purpose. Unexpectedly, my influence began to manifest in subtle, tangible ways. Colleagues who had previously been passive, hesitant, or fearful now began to assert themselves. They asked questions, highlighted inconsistencies, and implemented changes that had long been overdue. The company culture, once dominated by fear and deference, began to shift toward accountability and transparency. It was fascinating to witness the transformation from within, knowing that my strategic intervention had triggered this awakening. And while no one could attribute the change directly to me, I felt a quiet pride in the knowledge that my actions had created an enduring impact. Despite the positive outcomes, I had to navigate moments of tension and anxiety. Anonymous warnings continued to arrive, reminders that some people were still unsettled by the disruption I had initiated. Each message could have been destabilizing, but I approached them with calm analysis. Fear, I realized, was a tool, powerful when allowed to dominate, but ineffective when observed and managed thoughtfully. I reminded myself that true influence comes from clarity and integrity, and by adhering to those principles, I remained in control of my path and my actions. One afternoon, I received a call from a former colleague who had been quietly loyal to me over the years. She spoke in hushed tones, nervous yet relieved, describing how the audit had empowered her to confront issues she had previously ignored. Her words carried both gratitude and amazement. She had seen the changes ripple through the organization and recognized the courage it must have taken to act as I had. I smiled quietly, realizing that the impact of my choices extended far beyond myself. I had not only reclaimed my own agency, but had also inspired others to embrace integrity, accountability, and courage. That realization filled me with a profound sense of fulfillment. As the man's professional downfall became more apparent, I began to notice subtle shifts in the way power was perceived within the company. Meetings that had once been dominated by his presence were now collaborative, cautious, and thoughtful. Decisions were scrutinized, and transparency became a priority. Observing this, I understood that influence is rarely a direct, visible force. Instead, it is the quiet architecture of preparation, timing, and strategic patience that shapes outcomes most effectively. I had orchestrated change without stepping into the spotlight, and in doing so, I had discovered a deeper kind of strength, one that was resilient, patient, and sustainable. During this period, I also reflected on my personal growth. The humiliation and threats I had endured, once sources of fear and frustration, had become catalysts for transformation. I had learned to navigate complexity with composure, to act with foresight, and to harness fear as a motivator rather than a barrier. Each challenge had strengthened my confidence and sharpened my judgment. I realized that empowerment is rarely instantaneous. It is cultivated through consistent, deliberate action, guided by principle and tempered by reflection. The lessons I had learned in the shadows of fear had prepared me for the visible triumphs of this chapter. Unexpectedly, my strategy began to yield financial opportunities as well. During the process of compiling and verifying the audit, I had identified inefficiencies, overlooked revenue streams, and potential improvements within the company's operations. While I had not initially planned to leverage this knowledge for personal gain, the insights I had acquired were valuable. I began exploring ways to apply them in my own ventures, using the expertise I had cultivated over years of observation and careful study. The knowledge I had gained through meticulous preparation had become a foundation for new opportunities that would eventually lead to financial independence and significant success. Even as I pursued these new ventures, I remained aware of the risks involved. Maintaining discretion and strategic patience was essential. I avoided drawing attention to myself, understanding that exposure too early could jeopardize everything I had built. Instead, I focused on applying lessons of careful planning, attention to detail, and foresight. The skills I had honed while navigating the audit's release now became tools for building a sustainable path toward financial and professional growth. Each decision was deliberate, measured, and informed by both experience and reflection. I had achieved more than I could have imagined. The man who had threatened me was publicly confronted with the consequences of his actions. The company culture was shifting toward accountability, and I had discovered both personal empowerment and professional opportunity. The journey had transformed me in ways I had never anticipated. Fear and humiliation, once dominant forces, had been transformed into clarity, strength, and insight. The path I had taken was not without risk, but it had been guided by principle, patience, and careful observation. Sitting in my apartment one evening, watching the rain streak down the windows, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had faced threats, navigated betrayal, and acted strategically without compromising my integrity. I had turned moments of potential destruction into opportunities for transformation and growth. I had reclaimed my narrative, inspired others to act with courage, and discovered new avenues for success. And in that reflection, I realized the quiet moral of my journey. True power is not loud or visible. It is cultivated in the shadows through careful, principled action, patience, and resilience. The experiences of this chapter reinforced a fundamental truth. Humiliation and threats can be catalysts for growth, not destruction. When approached with clarity, strategy, and integrity, adversity can be transformed into empowerment, opportunity, and lasting change. And as I prepared for the next phase of my journey, I understood that the most profound transformations often begin quietly, unseen by others, yet capable of reshaping not just careers but lives. I had begun to realize that the storm I had weathered was giving way to opportunities I had never imagined. The man who had once threatened my reputation was no longer a figure of power. His career was faltering, and whispers of accountability followed him wherever he went. The company, once rigid and stifling, was slowly reshaping itself, guided by the exposure of the audit. And I, who had remained in the shadows, was quietly witnessing a transformation that went far beyond simple justice. The work I had done, the patience I had maintained, and the careful attention to detail were beginning to yield something more profound: personal empowerment and the emergence of opportunities I had only dreamed of. The lessons I had learned over the past months were becoming invaluable. I realized that patience and observation often outweigh immediate action. By stepping back and letting the consequences of truth unfold, I had preserved my safety while influencing outcomes decisively. I had also discovered the subtleties of human behavior, fear, guilt, and uncertainty often dictate decisions more than logic or rationality. Watching him falter, I understood how easily power can shift when accountability enters the equation. Every misstep he made, every reaction fueled by panic, reinforced the importance of strategic thinking and reminded me that careful planning is often more effective than confrontation. At the same time, I began to explore the professional insights I had gained while compiling the audit. I had noticed inefficiencies, overlooked revenue opportunities, and operational weaknesses that had gone unaddressed for years. These observations, initially collected as part of a defensive strategy, now became a blueprint for my own ventures. I began working quietly on plans to apply this knowledge to create independent projects, leveraging the expertise I had cultivated without exposing my identity. It was remarkable how skills developed under pressure and adversity could translate into entirely new avenues of success. I also reflected on the emotional journey that had brought me to this point. Fear, humiliation, and doubt had been constant companions at the start, but over time, they had been transformed into clarity, resilience, and purpose. Each sleepless night spent reviewing documents, every moment of careful analysis, and every decision to remain patient and strategic had contributed to a growing sense of empowerment. I realized that true strength is not born in moments of triumph, but in the quiet endurance of uncertainty, the deliberate cultivation of knowledge, and the courage to act with integrity despite fear. Amid these developments, my personal life began to shift subtly as well. Friends and trusted colleagues began noticing changes in my confidence and composure. They remarked on my calmness under pressure, my ability to analyze situations with precision, and my clarity of thought. I had always been careful not to draw attention to myself, but it was clear that the experience had strengthened me in ways that radiated quietly to those around me. I felt a growing sense of self-assurance, an inner calm that came from understanding that I had acted rightly, strategically, and without compromising my values. Financially, the situation was becoming even more intriguing. As I applied the operational insights from the audit to my own ventures, small successes began to accumulate. Projects I had started quietly, initially as experiments, began showing real potential. Revenue streams that had been invisible to others were now within my grasp. I realized that the knowledge I had acquired under duress had become a secret asset, a source of leverage that could be turned into tangible success. For the first time, I experienced the thrill of transforming adversity into opportunity, not recklessly, but with careful planning and foresight. The man who had tried to control me continued to struggle, unaware of the subtle ways his own downfall had created conditions for my success. I observed his attempts to regain influence, his strategic errors, and his growing isolation. Each misstep was a reminder that power is fragile when built on fear, threats, and manipulation. And each observation reinforced the lesson I had already internalized. Integrity, patience, and strategic action are far more durable foundations for influence than intimidation or coercion. During this time, I also began to experience moments of personal reflection and quiet gratitude. I considered how the challenges I had faced, humiliation, betrayal, and fear, had ultimately led to growth, insight, and empowerment. It was a paradox. The very forces that had once threatened to destroy me had become the catalysts for my transformation. I had learned to harness fear, to act strategically under pressure, and to remain patient in the face of uncertainty. These lessons were not theoretical. They were lived experiences, shaping both my professional decisions and my personal sense of resilience. As my projects began to gain traction, I realized that the ultimate victory was not about revenge or retaliation. It was about reclaiming agency, creating opportunities, and transforming the challenges imposed upon me into sources of empowerment. I had turned potential humiliation into strategic advantage, threats into motivation, and adversity into actionable insight. The satisfaction I felt was quiet but profound, rooted in the understanding that my success was built on careful planning, integrity, and the courage to act thoughtfully. By the end of this chapter, I had begun to see the full scope of my transformation. I had navigated fear, threat, and betrayal with patience and strategic foresight. I had observed the collapse of a figure who had once dominated my professional world, while quietly creating opportunities for myself that had long-term impact. I had learned the enduring lesson that empowerment is not about immediate gratification or visible triumph. It is about careful action, resilience, and the strategic use of knowledge to shape outcomes over time. Sitting in my apartment one rainy evening, reflecting on the journey, I felt a profound sense of calm and clarity. The fear and humiliation that had once dominated my thoughts were now replaced by quiet confidence and measured anticipation. I understood that the greatest victories are often unseen, their impact rippling outward quietly but powerfully. I had reclaimed my narrative, transformed adversity into opportunity, and discovered the subtle power of strategic patience. And in that realization, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that my journey had led not only to personal success, but to a deeper understanding of resilience, influence, and integrity. The chapter closed with a quiet promise to myself: the skills I had honed, the lessons I had learned, and the empowerment I had gained would guide me forward, not just in professional ventures, but in life itself. Humiliation and fear, once overwhelming, had become tools for growth. Betrayal had been transformed into insight, and the threats that had sought to destroy me had ultimately created the conditions for my quiet triumph. I had learned that adversity, when met with patience, strategic thought, and unwavering principle, can be the greatest teacher of all. The transformation I had quietly nurtured began to manifest in ways I had only imagined in my most cautious dreams. The man who had once threatened my career and reputation was now struggling to retain even the smallest fragment of authority. His panic, his missteps, and the unraveling of his carefully constructed world were unfolding as I had predicted, but the most significant changes were happening elsewhere, in my life, quietly, strategically, and deliberately. I had begun to take the insights from my meticulous audit work, the understanding of inefficiencies, and the lessons I had learned navigating fear and betrayal, and apply them to ventures that were my own. What had started as a defensive strategy was now becoming a pathway to genuine opportunity, empowerment, and success. At first, the projects were small test runs, quietly implemented minimal exposure. I applied operational changes to ventures that had potential, streamlined processes, and identified overlooked revenue streams. The skills I had honed under pressure, attention to detail, patience, careful observation, were now my greatest assets. I realized that everything I had endured, the humiliation, the constant threat, the anxiety, had been a hidden preparation for this very moment. Each sleepless night, each careful review of financial irregularities, each strategic decision I had made while remaining in the shadows had equipped me to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. The man's collapse continued in parallel. He attempted public statements, damage control, and negotiations, but each move revealed more inconsistencies and fueled speculation about his competence. The company, once rigid and dominated by fear, was now adapting to accountability and transparency. I observed all of it, careful not to be seen, yet absorbing lessons on influence, power, and human behavior. The contrast between my calm, measured approach and his reactive, panicked moves reinforced a lesson I had internalized months ago. Patience, preparation, and integrity often outweigh intimidation and aggression. Simultaneously, I began to witness the tangible results of my own ventures. Revenue, previously modest, began to grow steadily. Processes I had redesigned for efficiency yielded measurable outcomes. I even discovered opportunities for partnerships and collaborations that had been invisible before. Every success, no matter how small, reinforced the lesson that careful observation, preparation, and principled action can turn adversity into opportunity. The quiet satisfaction of seeing tangible results, built entirely from knowledge, skill, and strategic patience, was profoundly different from the fleeting thrill of revenge. It was sustainable, meaningful, and empowering. During this time, I also reflected deeply on my emotional journey. The humiliation I had endured, the fear I had felt, and the threats I had received had been transformed into a driving force. I realized that adversity often serves as a teacher, guiding us to cultivate skills we may never have developed otherwise. Fear, when acknowledged and understood, can become insight. Betrayal, when observed and analyzed, can become strategy. The experiences that once seemed overwhelming had become the foundation of my quiet empowerment, allowing me to navigate complex professional landscapes and identify opportunities that others overlooked. I began to notice subtle changes in those around me. Colleagues who had once been hesitant or cautious were now asserting themselves, encouraged by the culture of accountability that had emerged. Former allies of the man who had threatened me were now distancing themselves, unsure of how to navigate the new dynamics. I remained careful not to reveal my involvement, maintaining discretion while observing these shifts. It became clear to me that influence does not always require visibility. Often, the quiet architect, unseen, strategic, patient, wields the most lasting power. The very systems and behaviors I had studied in secret now revealed their vulnerabilities and strengths, and I acted with deliberate understanding. Unexpectedly, personal opportunities also began to appear. Trusted friends and colleagues, noticing the subtle changes in my confidence, expertise, and judgment, began seeking guidance, partnerships, and collaboration. My reputation, quietly cultivated through competence and strategic discretion, began to precede me in certain circles. I had never sought recognition or applause, but the acknowledgement of my abilities, earned through careful work, resilience, and insight, was deeply validating. I realized that empowerment is rarely about immediate visibility. It is about building capabilities, influence, and credibility in ways that manifest organically over time. Financial success, too, began to scale. The insights I had accumulated through months of careful study, once purely tactical, now became strategic advantages. I applied operational improvements, optimized revenue streams, and implemented changes that had a measurable impact. Small wins grew into larger opportunities, and I began to understand that the foundation of long-term success is often laid quietly, through observation, preparation, and principled action rather than immediate, visible effort. The sense of autonomy and control I felt was intoxicating, not in an ego-driven way, but as a testament to the power of foresight, patience, and strategic thinking. Even as I experienced these shifts, I remained mindful of the lessons learned from earlier challenges. The man who had tried to control and intimidate me continued to struggle, his reactive decisions creating new opportunities for me to apply my knowledge discreetly. I observed, analyzed, and acted only when necessary, understanding that patience and timing were essential for sustained impact. The transformation of my life, professional, financial, and personal, was not sudden. It had been cultivated carefully, step by step, over months of meticulous planning, observation, and strategic action. Emotionally, I felt a profound sense of quiet fulfillment. The fear, Humiliation and anxiety that had once dominated my thoughts were now replaced by confidence, calm, and clarity. I had learned to harness adversity as a tool, transforming obstacles into actionable insight. The lessons of resilience, patience, and integrity had become embedded in my approach to both professional ventures and personal growth. And the satisfaction of seeing tangible outcomes, change in the company, success in my projects, and influence over outcomes without exposure was deeply gratifying. By the end of Chapter 7, the trajectory of my life had shifted dramatically. The man who had threatened my reputation was diminished, unable to control outcomes, and scrambling to regain relevance. Meanwhile, I had quietly transformed my knowledge, insights, and experiences into strategic advantage, financial growth, and personal empowerment. The journey had taught me that adversity, when met with patience, preparation, and principled action, can be the catalyst for transformation. I had turned humiliation into insight, fear into strategy, and betrayal into opportunity. Sitting in my apartment one evening, watching the city lights refract through the rain-streaked windows, I reflected on the remarkable journey. The lessons were clear. Power built on intimidation is fragile. Influence grounded in preparation and integrity endures. Fear can be converted into clarity, threats can become catalysts for insight, and adversity can pave the way for opportunity. I had reclaimed my narrative, quietly engineered my own success, and discovered that the greatest victories are often unseen, sustained, and rooted in patience, strategic thought, and unwavering principle. The results of my quiet, strategic efforts were becoming undeniable. The man who had once threatened my career was now barely able to maintain control over the remnants of his professional life. He stumbled through meetings, mismanaged decisions, and faced constant scrutiny from the board and his colleagues. Meanwhile, my own ventures, built on the insights, patience, and careful planning I had cultivated, were beginning to flourish. What had started as small, discrete experiments were now showing real, measurable results, and I began to feel the full weight of what I had achieved. The irony was almost surreal. The very circumstances designed to humiliate and control me had been transformed into the foundation of my success. Each day, I observed subtle yet powerful changes around me. Former colleagues who had been silent for years began to voice ideas, raise concerns, and take initiative. The company culture, once dominated by fear and compliance, was evolving into one that valued transparency, accountability, and collaboration. I watched these changes with quiet pride, knowing that my actions had indirectly catalyzed this transformation. It was not revenge for its own sake that brought satisfaction, but the realization that integrity, patience, and strategic action could reshape an environment for the better. The subtle, far-reaching effects of truth and accountability were far more gratifying than immediate recognition or applause. Financially, the momentum in my ventures accelerated. The operational insights I had gathered during the audit, combined with careful application and strategic patience, created efficiencies that were previously overlooked. Revenue streams I had discovered and optimized were generating tangible returns, and new opportunities for growth began appearing almost organically. Each small success reinforced the principle I had learned: preparation and foresight, applied consistently, yield results that are both lasting and meaningful. I realized that empowerment is not always sudden or visible. It is often cultivated quietly, through disciplined action, patience, and understanding. The man's reactions continued to be instructive. He attempted damage control, sought advice, and made desperate maneuvers to regain influence. Yet each action only revealed further vulnerabilities, mistakes, and misjudgments. Observing him, I recognized the fragility of power built on fear and intimidation. Authority, when unearned or manipulated, is easily eroded by accountability and truth. I had seen firsthand that the most enduring form of power is grounded not in threats or coercion, but in integrity, preparation, and careful, strategic action. And as I continued to apply these principles in my own ventures, I began to experience a profound sense of freedom and empowerment. Emotionally, this period was both exhilarating and reflective. I had transformed fear and humiliation into clarity, patience, and strategic insight. I had navigated threats and betrayal with calm precision, never allowing anger or panic to dictate my actions. In their place, I cultivated focus, foresight, and composure. Each success, no matter how small, carried the weight of lessons learned from adversity. I began to appreciate the paradox of my journey. The very experiences designed to suppress me had, in fact, become the foundation of my strength, wisdom, and ultimate empowerment. Unexpectedly, I began receiving subtle recognition from trusted peers and industry contacts. Without revealing my role in the audit or the strategic changes I had implemented, others noticed my competence, judgment, and strategic vision. They sought advice, partnerships, and collaboration, unaware of the full scope of my influence behind the scenes. I had learned that influence does not always require visibility. Quiet competence, thoughtful action, and principled strategy often create the most enduring impact. The awareness of this fact brought a quiet, profound satisfaction, far deeper than public praise or validation could ever provide. Meanwhile, the man who had tried to dominate and intimidate me faced increasing scrutiny. External auditors, board members, and colleagues all observed discrepancies that had once been hidden. Each attempt he made to regain control only compounded his errors, highlighting the contrast between reactive panic and deliberate strategy. I remained in the background, careful not to reveal myself, yet acutely aware that my previous planning had created the conditions for my eventual success. Observing the collapse of his authority reinforced the lessons I had internalized months ago. Patience, discretion, and integrity are far more powerful than intimidation, threats, or rash action. As my financial ventures began to scale, I also began reflecting on the broader lessons of my journey. Fear, humiliation, and betrayal had been catalysts for growth, teaching me resilience, strategic thinking, and the importance of preparation. I had learned to navigate complex professional landscapes, recognize hidden opportunities, and act with calculated precision. The transformation I experienced was not just financial or professional, it was deeply personal. I had cultivated confidence, composure, and a sense of agency that no external force could take away. By this point, the impact of my actions was undeniable, even if unacknowledged publicly. Colleagues who had once feared speaking up were now contributing meaningfully to organizational change. The man who had threatened me was no longer an imposing figure. His authority had diminished, and his credibility eroded. Meanwhile, my own ventures were generating tangible success and positioning me for long-term growth. I began to see the culmination of my efforts, not as a singular moment of triumph, but as the quiet, cumulative effect of months of preparation, patience, and strategic action. One evening, as I reviewed the financial progress and operational improvements I had implemented, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. Everything that had once felt like a threat, humiliation, intimidation, betrayal, had become the foundation for empowerment, insight, and growth. I realized that adversity is not a wall to stop you. It can be a pathway if approached with patience, observation, and principle. Each challenge I had faced had been transformed into a tool for learning, strategy, and eventual success. The quiet satisfaction of seeing these results unfold, without public recognition or fanfare, was deeply fulfilling. I had reached a pivotal point in my journey. The man who had sought to control and intimidate me had been dismantled by the very truths he had tried to suppress, while I had quietly transformed knowledge, insight, and adversity into empowerment and success. The foundations for my financial independence, professional credibility, and personal agency were now firmly established. I understood that the greatest victories are rarely visible or immediate. They are built patiently, strategically, and with unwavering integrity. Sitting alone one rainy evening, I reflected on how far I had come. The fear, humiliation, and threats that had once loomed over me had been converted into opportunity, resilience, and quiet triumph. I had reclaimed my narrative, shaped outcomes without exposure, and built a platform for long-term success. The moral was clear. Adversity, when navigated thoughtfully and with principle, can become a catalyst for transformation. Patience, discretion, and strategic insight are more powerful than reaction, confrontation, or fleeting triumph. And in that quiet realization, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that my journey had reached a stage of meaningful, lasting impact. The transformation I had quietly orchestrated was now fully visible, at least in its effects, if not in my own acknowledgement. The man who had once threatened my reputation was no longer a force to be reckoned with. Meetings that had once trembled under his presence now proceeded with calm deliberation, accountability, and scrutiny. His attempts to reclaim authority only emphasized his failures, making his downfall more apparent to those around him. Meanwhile, the ventures I had cultivated in secret were flourishing. What had begun as discreet experiments had grown into significant achievements, generating revenue, recognition, and opportunities that I had long dreamed of. The contrast between his collapse and my quiet ascent was striking, yet I felt no need to gloat. My satisfaction came not from seeing him falter, but from knowing that careful, principled action could transform adversity into lasting success. Each day brought new validation of the work I had done, processes I had optimized, inefficiencies I had corrected, and operational insights I had applied were producing tangible results. Revenue streams that had previously gone unnoticed were now contributing substantially to my growing independence. I realized, with a sense of quiet wonder, that everything I had endured, the fear, the humiliation, the betrayal, had equipped me to act decisively when the opportunity arose. The skills I had honed under pressure, patience, observation, strategic thinking, were now yielding the outcomes I had only imagined during sleepless nights filled with uncertainty and anxiety. The man's reactions continued to provide lessons, though now more subtle. He attempted negotiations, public statements, and damage control, but each effort revealed more errors, inconsistencies, and miscalculations. Watching him struggle, I understood that power built on intimidation is inherently unstable. Authority that relies on fear and manipulation cannot withstand scrutiny, truth, or strategic patience. My own influence, by contrast, had been cultivated quietly, without exposure or ego, and was now manifesting in ways that were both durable and meaningful. I had discovered a profound truth: the most effective form of power is often invisible, built on preparation, insight, and unwavering principle. Emotionally, I felt a sense of liberation I had never known. The humiliation, threats, and anxiety that had once consumed me were now replaced by clarity, confidence, and calm. I had navigated treacherous waters without compromise, and in doing so, had reclaimed control over my life, my career, and my sense of self. The journey had taught me that true empowerment is not immediate or dramatic. It is cultivated patiently, step by step, through deliberate, principled action. The quiet victories of competence, insight, and resilience were far more meaningful than any public acknowledgement or validation. Unexpectedly, personal relationships also shifted during this time. Colleagues and industry contacts, drawn by the subtle changes in my composure, judgment, and insight, began seeking guidance, partnerships, and collaboration. I had built credibility not through visibility, but through action, observation, and strategic discretion. The realization that influence could be exerted quietly, without recognition, brought a deep, lasting satisfaction. I began to understand that empowerment is as much about the unseen impact one has on others as it is about tangible achievements. Financially, this period marked the culmination of my careful efforts. The ventures I had nurtured, initially small, experimental, and discreet, were now generating significant returns. Operational improvements, revenue optimization, and strategic partnerships created a robust foundation for long-term growth. I had transformed knowledge gained under duress into tangible success, turning adversity into an asset. The realization that the threats and humiliation I had once endured were, in fact, preparation for this moment was both humbling and empowering. I had not only survived the storm, I had used it to build a life far stronger than I had ever anticipated. Meanwhile, the man's position continued to deteriorate. His credibility was eroding, and the board and colleagues were increasingly questioning his decisions and judgment. Each attempt at control only underscored his instability and lack of preparation. Observing this, I reflected on the contrast between reaction and strategy, between impulsive attempts to dominate and deliberate, patient cultivation of influence. I realized that success achieved through foresight, integrity, and calculated action is far more enduring than that one through fear, manipulation, or aggression. As my ventures grew, I also began to appreciate the personal lessons embedded in this journey. Fear had become insight, humiliation had become strategy, and betrayal had become a catalyst for empowerment. I had cultivated patience, observation, and strategic thinking, not only as professional tools but as life skills. Each challenge had strengthened my resilience, sharpened my judgment, and deepened my understanding of both people and systems. I realized that empowerment is rarely the product of immediate triumph. It is the outcome of sustained, principled effort over time, often quietly and without recognition. By this stage, the impact of my actions was visible not just in the company or my ventures, but in the subtle shifts around me. Colleagues who had been hesitant were now speaking up, contributing ideas, and implementing change. The culture that had once enabled fear and intimidation was transforming into one that valued accountability and collaboration. I had influenced this transformation indirectly, quietly, without exposure or confrontation. It was a profound reminder that lasting impact is often cultivated behind the scenes, through strategic, principled action rather than overt display. One evening, as I reflected on the journey, I felt a deep sense of completion. The fear, humiliation, and threats that had once dominated my thoughts were now distant memories. In their place were confidence, clarity, and a sense of agency I had never experienced before. I had turned adversity into opportunity, transformed threats into insight, and cultivated a foundation for long-term success that no external force could undermine. The quiet satisfaction of achieving this, without exposure, recognition, or public acknowledgement, was profound. The story had reached its near climax. The man who had attempted to control and intimidate me had been dismantled by the very truths he had tried to suppress. Meanwhile, I had quietly built a life of opportunity, financial independence, and personal empowerment. The journey had transformed me, teaching lessons about patience, integrity, strategic thinking, and the subtle power of observation. I had discovered that adversity, when navigated thoughtfully and with principle, can become the foundation for lasting success. Sitting alone that evening, watching the rain cascade down the windows, I reflected on the journey's ultimate truth. The greatest victories are often unseen, cultivated patiently, and grounded in principle. Fear can become insight, betrayal can become strategy, and humiliation can become the catalyst for empowerment. I had reclaimed my narrative, quietly influenced outcomes, and built a foundation for long-term success and personal fulfillment. And in that quiet realization, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that the final chapter would bring not only culmination, but clarity, resolution, and the ultimate affirmation of my journey. Everything I had worked for, the patience, the planning, the strategic observation, had come together. The man who had once threatened my career and reputation had completely lost his authority. His decisions were questioned at every level, and the whispers of his failures had become undeniable. Yet my focus was no longer on him. My attention was on the opportunities I had quietly cultivated, the ventures I had nurtured in the shadows, and the life I was finally able to claim for myself. It was a profound moment of realization. I had turned the very adversity meant to humiliate and control me into a foundation for empowerment, independence, and success beyond what I had dared to imagine. The final phase of my journey was as much personal as it was professional. Months of careful planning, strategic patience, and discreet execution had transformed the knowledge I gained under duress into tangible achievements. Operational insights, previously leveraged only to expose mismanagement, were now actively creating revenue, partnerships, and growth in my own ventures. What had once been a quiet, experimental project was now generating financial independence and positioning me for lasting influence. The thrill of this success was quiet and reflective. It was not about ego or recognition, but the deep satisfaction of having reclaimed control over my life. I also realized that my journey had reshaped my emotional and personal resilience. The humiliation, threats, and fear that had dominated earlier chapters had been converted into insight, strategic judgment, and inner strength. I had learned to navigate high-pressure situations with calm precision, to act decisively without haste, and to maintain integrity even when provoked. Each moment of adversity had become a lesson in foresight, patience, and perseverance. I understood that empowerment is not a momentary victory, but a state of being cultivated through consistent, deliberate action over time. Financially, the results were undeniable. The ventures I had carefully nurtured were now generating substantial revenue. Operational inefficiencies I had identified were corrected, overlooked opportunities were now streams of income, and partnerships I had quietly explored were coming to fruition. I had not only recovered what was at risk, but had surpassed any expectation I had ever held. My financial independence was no longer a distant dream. It was tangible, strategic, and fully realized. Each decision I had made in the shadows had contributed to this outcome, and the realization of this was profoundly empowering. Meanwhile, the man who had attempted to control me had been reduced to a cautionary tale. His reputation was diminished, his credibility shattered, and his authority undermined. Witnessing his decline was not satisfying in a vengeful sense. It was simply a confirmation of the power of principle, preparation, and patience. I understood that his downfall was not orchestrated for revenge, but rather was a natural consequence of mismanagement, deception, and failure to anticipate accountability. My role had been one of observation, documentation, and strategic intervention, not malice, yet the outcome brought a quiet sense of vindication. As my ventures continued to flourish, I reflected on the lessons that adversity had taught me. Humiliation had forced me to confront my vulnerabilities. Fear had sharpened my observation and judgment. Betrayal had prompted strategic thinking and patience. And through it all, I had learned to act with integrity, discretion, and precision. Each challenge I faced had been transformed into a tool for empowerment. I realized that the greatest successes often emerge not from public triumphs, but from quiet, deliberate effort guided by principle and foresight. Unexpectedly, I began to see the broader impact of my actions. Colleagues, inspired by subtle changes in culture, were more proactive, accountable, and engaged. Operations I had influenced quietly were now setting a standard for efficiency and collaboration. The environment around me was transforming in ways I had only hoped for, proof that strategic, principled action can ripple outward, creating lasting change even when the initiator remains unseen. I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that my efforts had not only restored my agency, but had positively influenced others, actions, and decisions. Emotionally, this chapter was transformative. I had moved from fear and humiliation to empowerment and confidence. Each calculated step, every moment of strategic patience, and all the unseen decisions had culminated in a life that reflected my resilience, intelligence, and foresight. I had discovered that true power is not always visible, but it is deeply felt, rooted in autonomy, competence, and the ability to shape outcomes deliberately. The quiet satisfaction of achieving this, without public acknowledgement, was far more rewarding than any external recognition could have been. The climax of this journey was both subtle and profound. I had not only secured financial independence and professional credibility, but had also reclaimed my narrative. The man who had threatened me had failed, and I had succeeded, not through confrontation, but through strategy, patience, and integrity. I realized that success built on principle is enduring, whereas power built on fear is fragile. The experiences that had once seemed like obstacles had become the very foundation of my triumph. In the quiet of that realization, I felt a deep sense of peace and closure. One rainy evening, as I reflected on the entire journey, the full significance of my transformation became clear. The humiliation I had endured had taught me resilience. The threats I had faced had taught me patience. The betrayal I had navigated had taught me strategy. And the quiet, deliberate actions I had taken had turned adversity into opportunity. I had not only reclaimed my life, but had built a future that was secure, empowered, and reflective of my values. The ultimate lesson of this journey was unmistakable. When faced with challenges, maintaining principle, patience, and strategic foresight can turn even the darkest circumstances into a foundation for lasting success. By the end of Chapter 10, I had achieved not only personal and financial victory, but also emotional closure. The man who had sought to intimidate me was irrelevant to my continued growth. My ventures were flourishing, my confidence was restored, and my strategic influence, though quiet, was enduring. I had discovered that true empowerment is cultivated in patience, discretion, and principled action. Adversity, humiliation, and betrayal, when navigated thoughtfully, can become the stepping stones to transformation, opportunity, and lasting fulfillment. Sitting quietly in my apartment, listening to the rain streak the windows, I felt a sense of completion. The journey had been long, filled with fear, doubt, and humiliation, yet it had ultimately led to clarity, empowerment, and triumph. I had turned obstacles into opportunities, threats into insights, and betrayal into strategy. And in that quiet realization, I understood a truth that I would carry forward for the rest of my life. The greatest victories are often unseen, quietly cultivated, and grounded in principle. They are the ones that endure, shaping not only our lives but the world around us.